Hi everyone, Joshua Hanlon here at BrickFair Virginia 2019, and we're about to go through a massive Cold War era collaborative layout here at BrickFair. So I've got Magnus with me today. If you want to give an overview of the layout, and then we'll have each builder kind of talk about what they brought.
Thanks. This is collaborative display focusing on the Cold War era. Last year, you may remember we had something focused on the Vietnam War, and we wanted to kind of continue in that vein with a collaborative thing where everyone builds their own separate display or vehicle and then displays it on a table together, as opposed to trying to, say, build a large diorama where everyone is responsible for a little segment, and then that way if someone drops out, then you're stuck with some hole in the middle of it. You know, this is a pretty serious political topic, and with some pretty serious ramifications and things like that. So we wanted to present it in a sort of tasteful, respectful way. So we have these information sheets along the edge, not to look too much like a museum, but we wanted it to be a sort of exhibit, if you will. So there's a bit of information with a bit of history in there. Well,
fantastic. So let's dive into the builds here. So we'll start with the big plane we have down here. So Jack, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go through the builds.
All right, so yeah, my name is Jack Carleson. I Big Planes on YouTube and Flickr, and this is, well, it's a big plane. It's the B-36 Peacemaker, and it took about 3 months to build, and I would say maybe between 15 to 20,000 parts. But the story behind this thing is really just sort of what they did back in the 50s and what was before the B-52, but after most of the World War II bombers. So this was built with sort of a World War II bomber in mind. It was designed so in case the UK or England fell during World War II, they could send bombers from the U.S. mainland and attack Germany and most of mainland Europe. So that was why this thing is so big. And it did have 6, I believe, Pratt & Whitney 4360 prop engines in the back, which is quite a few. They were not the most reliable, but you had 6 of them, so you could lose a couple and it would still go. And it did have 4 jet engines. These are turbojets mounted in pods under the wing. And the main role with this plane, especially during the Cold War, which was for this thing probably between 1949 and 59, this is when this was in service the most, it would have been used to carry the large nuclear bomb, the Mark 17, I believe is what this one's called. It may have been carrying other stuff, but I'm not sure. It did have a lot of weird stuff going on, so like the Goblin right there, it's just sort of tried stuff back then. So the Goblin was here, I can sort of demonstrate this to you if I can here. It was designed to actually fold up and fit in the bomb base of the B-36. It was a parasite fighter. Didn't work very well. It's had a couple accidents which caused it to sort of crash, and they scrapped the program after about 2 of them built, but it was an idea. It was one of those things they just tried with the B-36, and like I said earlier, it's not the most reliable plane. It had some engine issues, especially cooling, but this was one of those weird things that it kind of showed you right before your eyes the transition from props to jets. And they added these jet engines actually later on into later B-36 models because it needed to be faster. It needed to compete with other stuff, and especially with jets like the MiGs and some other Russian stuff entering the battlefield, it needed to go faster, and eventually would have been replaced by the B-52 because it would have been obsolete at that point. So yeah, this is pretty much the story behind the B-36. This is the D model, so it's a later variant, so probably in the mid to late 50s, but yeah, it would have been replaced by the B-52 Stratofortress later on.
It's a massive, impressive plane here, and the movement with the propellers, I think, just adds a lot of detail and really catches your eye.
Oh yeah, the props. That was something that was interesting. I had to put a battery pack in the front and one in the back, and I actually wired it out to each engine. There's a separate Power Functions M or small motor in each engine, which has its own prop, and it's pretty reliable. It'll run without any issues, but it'll only run for about 2 hours.
Hi, I'm Ed Diment. I've come here from the UK, and I'm displaying this Soviet submarine. So,
since you were coming from such a far distance, you brought a very small model with you.
Yeah, that made sense. I would go for the largest model in the display, but it does pack down quite neatly into a suitcase, unbelievably, so it's in a whole series of sections. But when I spoke to Magnus about things, he was saying there's not enough stuff on the Eastern Bloc Soviet side of things, so I was thinking about doing something else, but I actually ended up plumping for doing a submarine. I'm a bit known for doing ships, so I thought something that would fit into that sort of same category.
Yes. So how was this submarine used during the Cold War?
This is a Yankee-class submarine. It's one of the first classes of Russian ballistic missile submarines. So before this, both the United States and the Russians were experimenting with how you actually launch missiles from a submarine, and they came up with the same sort of solution of effectively having the missile inside a tube that could be blown out with compressed air when submerged, rather like a torpedo, and then when the missile breaks the sea surface, the rocket motor ignites and it flies effectively into space and then showers down its nuclear warheads on the poor unfortunate victims. So it's not very friendly.
but very effective.
Yes. So the Yankee class was actually the most numerous class of Russian submarines. They came up with better, more sophisticated submarines later on during the Cold War, but this was the mainstay of the Russian nuclear deterrent fleet.
And it looks like this kind of came together in sections for you, so talk about kind of the overall design of the model.
Yeah, so I actually, interestingly, calculated the length of each section based on the size of the suitcase I was going to bring it in, so it really did come in that. So it's actually in 5 hull sections. The sail actually lifts off as well, so I can kind of just show you it's just literally sitting on there, and it just sort of self-locates into position. And has the movable fins there. It also comes with the occasional cat hair, courtesy of my 2 cats at home. And I've made all of the actual hatches open and close like the ones on the real submarine, so you can fold that down and actually pop that in and then simply open it up. And it carried 16 ballistic missiles.
Wow. So basically all black model here. Was it difficult to find any of these pieces in black that you needed for this build?
No, I stuck to fairly common black parts. There's nothing too unusual on here. The quantities obviously in some cases are a little bit challenging. I don't think I've got any more too long black cheese slopes left in my collection now, so that's used most of them. But obviously the submarines tend to be black. There's not much you can do about that. That's not a colour that photographs or films well, but that's hence bringing some water along so it doesn't just disappear into the tablecloth completely.
The black tablecloth.
Yes. But yeah, that's what submarines look like, so that's what I had to go with. So.
Well, it's an impressive model. I'm glad you were able to bring it out and add it to the overall collaboration here. Great work.
Thank you very much. I also mentioned that there's the P3 Orion. So Micah, who built this, is not here just at the moment, but I thought I'd quickly talk about it because it relates very much to the submarine. It's why we've displayed it alongside it. So along with the advent of submarines during the Cold War, the development of anti-submarine warfare as a result had to move on a great deal, because clearly these things became one of the main threats to the world during the Cold War. So both sides were developing the means of hunting down and destroying the submarines. So the US came up with the P3 Orion, which is a very effective submarine hunting aircraft, turboprop powered, which are very efficient engine type, so it enabled it to stay on station for a very long time whilst it hunted the submarines. It could actually launch sonar buoys, drop them from out the bottom of the aircraft. They would land in the water and use sound to detect Russian submarines, transmit that information back to the aircraft, and the crew on board had a whole array of technological equipment to actually assess the signals and actually work out whether there was a submarine down there and which type of submarine, etc. And they could then actually attack the submarine by dropping torpedoes from the aircraft to try and sink the submarine. So
it's kind of the complete package all in one plane here.
Yeah, highly effective anti-submarine warfare. There were quite a lot of other different systems. There were smaller aircraft that went on new aircraft carriers and so on, but the P3 Orion was a sort of mainstay and was operated out of bases all around the world, in not only the US but Diego Garcia and Japan and all over the place. So these things were flying around all the time during the Cold War, keeping track of Russian submarines.
So it pairs very nicely with your build.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're both at the same scale, the same 1 in 43 minifig scale that we've used for it, so you can get a very good comparison side by side of how big the submarine was compared to the aircraft.
My name is Yasser, and I built the AC-47 Spooky gunship over here. So this was part of the Vietnam War specifically. It was a C-47 version that the U.S. Air Force used. They just put a bunch of guns in the side windows and painted it camouflage and used it in Vietnam for close air support during the nighttime. And yeah.
You had some great camo patterns on that.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it would be really hard at first because I originally built my C-47 in all dark bluish gray. And then when I wanted to build it in camouflage, I thought it would be really difficult to source the parts, but it was very smooth to build and very easy to get the parts. Yeah.
And then, is this your model here as well?
Yes. Yes, sir. That's my large-scale MiG-15. It's in a scale of 1 to 22, like a lot of my other large-scale models, which really allows you to get a lot more detail and a lot more functionality in it. So it has some working features, sliding cockpit, like that. I also put a light brick in there. There you go, in the cockpit. You can close it. Now, you take it. It has working wing flaps right here, right? And also working air brakes on that. Yeah, and then it also has, I'm working on putting the wing lights. That's a work in progress, but for now, that's all I have. Yep. Oh.
I love that with the iconic nose of that plane there.
Oh yeah, exactly. I think that was one of the most important parts, and I, spent a lot of time on the nose. That nose was the longest taking part of the airplane.
Yeah. Well, great work. So we'll come back to Ralph. Is this your model here?
Yes. Well, there are a couple here.
Okay.
This is as part of the Cold War. There were sort of regional conflicts. I think we have the Vietnam War represented, and we have the Korean War represented. And this is one of the representatives of the Korean War. It's a U.S. Navy F4U Corsair, which was the World War II era aircraft that was still in service at the start of the Korean War. They already had jets, but the jets were limited in the amount of bombs that they could carry and missiles that they could carry and in their range. So propeller aircraft, even old ones, were still actively being used. And this is based on an old model that I built maybe 12 years ago for the Intrepid aircraft carrier, the Lego Intrepid aircraft carrier that's in New York. So I updated it with new parts. It's all dark blue now because there's been many more new dark blue parts introduced that there weren't 12 years ago. I think this was something I did together with Ed Diment, who you'll be talking to as well. We single-handedly drove up the price of dark blue Lego at the time. But we didn't have all the parts we needed to make the planes dark blue. Now I do. So the bottom is dark blue, and you can see some of the missiles and the bombs. These are fuel tanks, and one of the party pieces is the sliding canopy, which was hard to do with a minifig pilot. And unlike most of my models, this is mostly studless, and it has folding wings for use on aircraft carriers. And yeah, that's the Corsair.
Very impressive. Some good functionality you were able to put in there.
I know lots of people have built Corsairs with functionality, but making it this small, well, that was a bit tricky. Yeah. But new parts like very useful hinges in dark blue made it a lot easier. So yeah, and big four-bladed propeller. It's They were used for close air support mainly, for supporting troops that were fighting, bombing quite close to the troops occasionally, and they were the workhorses of the U.S. Navy during the Korean War. And we have a little base for it and some fun stuff. And the other model that I built that's here is from the Vietnam War. It's that little bit over there. You might think, is that a military model? It kind of is. In the Vietnam War, North and South Vietnam were separated by an area called the demilitarized zone, and troops in the south that were being supported from the north, they got their supplies by people carrying most of their supplies on their backs along trails through the jungle. And these trails are known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And people in bicycles, people with rucksacks, carrying equipment to the south. And that's what this represents. So you have a bunch of figures with a bicycle and equipment. And the reason why I built this was, first of all, we wanted to have a representation not just of the West but also of the East. So this is an example of that. And also, you had the might of the U.S. Armed Forces with all of their equipment and all of their technology, fighting people on bicycles, basically. And I found that really interesting, that despite all the technology, the United States didn't win, not because of the technology, but because because of the circumstances and because basically the other side wouldn't give up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a sign of the North Vietnamese commitment to the war when you consider they were carrying like artillery pieces up mountainsides just by hand. It's insane.
And really under terrible conditions. I mean, I don't, and they kept going, and there was really nothing that the United States probably could have done to stop them eventually. They tried, they certainly tried. They bombed a lot of jungle, and they turned a lot of trees into matchsticks, but they never were able to stop the flow. And so that's an interesting part of the war, and certainly I think from the non-American perspective, it might be interesting to see this.
Yeah.
So that's
thank you.
You're welcome.
So let's see, what do we have next year?
Well, I can talk about a couple of other Vietnam era things. There's a tunnel system right behind the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's something I brought last year also BrickFair also, but I figured it would be good to show it off again. And it's another example of, you know, in this case particularly ingenious guerrilla warfare. How do you carry out a war against an enemy that is just far more technologically sophisticated? And these tunnels, there were miles and miles of them. When I started reading up on them, I learned a lot that I had no idea about before, just how expansive these networks were. And they allowed the Viet Cong to travel underground and, you know, amass armies and really disappear. And they were very hard to deal with. You know, the Americans would bomb them and send soldiers down them, but it was very hard to shut them down, and it took years and years before that finally happened. So in this case, there are Viet Cong who are using a tunnel to pop up and about to surprise an American patrol. I think that's more or less what's happening here. I can also talk about the M113, which is the armored vehicle that you see right there, and that was an armored personnel carrier that the Americans were using, and it's a good example of the kind of modern military technology that you know, the Americans just had a whole lot of. It certainly did a lot of. It was a pretty potent vehicle, though it certainly wasn't invulnerable. There were American soldiers who preferred to sit on top rather than sit inside, because they figured if they ran over a mine, they'd have a better chance of surviving if they just got thrown off the top of the vehicle. But that's, you know, as an APC, it was one of the early ones, and went on to serve in many other wars and in several varieties and different versions of it used across the West up through the 21st century.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that, because I feel like that, kind of along with the Huey helicopter, are kind of two of the iconic vehicles from the war. You see in so many photos and video clips and that sort of thing.
Absolutely, and we sort of take APCs for granted now as part of warfare, but they didn't really have any fully covered APCs in World War II. I mean, they had half tracks that were used in similar ways that were open on top, but in the 50s and 60s, this was a new way of protecting infantry and, you know, giving them a chance to rest a little on the way to a battlefield instead of having to march all the way there or drive there by truck. So this was brand new technology in the 60s.
Yeah, well, great work. Then I think Jack, do we have one of your models here as well?
Oh yeah, that's the little minifigure scale MiG-15. Now, it was sort of a last-minute item. I wanted to have something to go with Ralph's Corsair, but it's a fun little build, so here I can try to demonstrate some of the features it has. I tried to throw together a little base for it, kind of like Ralph's, but, you know, it works. This is a small APU that I threw together to sort of complement it, and there is a guy here just watching, making sure. Now, this is a MiG-15, so it's not the MiG-17, and it does have a retracting undercarriage. Now, it's a little finicky, but I can try to demonstrate for you here. It mostly just folds in on a mixel joint and folds right in like so. Again, it works. It's pretty basic. And the nose gear, let's see if we can get this to work. Doesn't always want to work, but it's somewhat like that. So that's what I came up with, the nose gear. There's no door, but it does work. And the cockpit or the bubble canopy, I decided to sort of brick build this and have a pilot in there. So it's just his head. I know it might be kind of hard to see, but
gives the idea.
Yeah, it's it's close enough, right? And the elevators, I was sort of, when I was designing this, I thought, oh, it's a full moving elevator, right? Now it actually turns out they were just the back part. So we're gonna pretend it doesn't have that feature, but it's kind of cool. I think it looks good having the whole thing up, but it's inaccurate. So we're gonna keep it like this for now. But yeah, so it's a fairly simple model, and it's pretty durable. It uses mostly newer parts. I tried to use more curved slopes in this model than I usually do at some of the newer bits. However, it's mostly just a little diorama here to throw together for the collaboration. It was something that I enjoyed doing, and I hope to do more smaller stuff like this in the future, because the big stuff takes a lot of room and time. So small stuff is also kind of fun.
Yeah, some more great Soviet aircraft there, so thank you.
Well, this thing is weird, and that made it interesting to me. So I'm from the Netherlands, which is a country that is, well, partially below sea level. So when I think of coastal defenses, I think of a seawall or a dike or dunes. But the East Germans did things a little differently. This is a East German coastal defense system built in the Soviet Union called a Rubik. I'm not quite sure whether I pronounced that correctly. And what it does is, well, it's a vehicle, obviously, an 8-wheeled off-road vehicle with a large missile launcher on the back with 2 anti-ship missiles, and they are radar guided, and it has its own folding radar on a mast to elevate it above the horizon so that they could actually find targets over long distances. And these were on the Baltic coast of former East Germany to be used against NATO shipping. And it's just weird. I wanted to do something East German because the divide between East and West Germany was very central to the Cold War in Europe, and I started looking for East German equipment, and I came across a picture of this, and I thought, that's just bizarre. I want to have one of them. And there was a lot of shaping going on, and the camouflage scheme that made it an interesting build, and also the mast with the radar can slide down, which I'm not going to demonstrate because it'll break. And the missile launcher in the back, I can show that off. That can be stored when it's driving. There's this massive overhang at the rear, but that's what it's supposed to look like. That made it really interesting.
Now, when you're working on a vehicle like this, something that's maybe a little less well known than some of the other things we're showing here, is it difficult to find sort of resource photos and that sort of thing, or can you still find a lot of stuff out there about it?
Fortunately, one of these is in a museum,
okay.
And that means that there are a lot of photographs taken by people who have visited the museum, which helps. And also there are a number of, I think, Russian companies that make model kits, and model kits are always a very useful reference. People post pictures of the model that they built, and you see it from different angles than you would normally see the real vehicle, so you can figure out a lot of the details that you wouldn't be able to see in the museum, actually. So no, for this one it was pretty easy. Plenty of pictures out there. And it is an East German version that is in the museum, so that came in handy, also with the camouflage.
Perfect. Well, I think that you captured it nicely, so going in a little less well-known direction, I like it.
Yeah, the obscure ones are sometimes the interesting ones. And this one, I thought, it looks like something out of G.I. Joe, and but it was a real military vehicle. So yeah, that made it interesting.
There we go. So we'll move down to the next build here. Let's see. Gary, do you want to talk about your build?
So I will eventually talk about my build, but let's talk about the MIAA build first. This is not mine. This is Bret Harris's. He's not here right now. So what this is, again, this is the Cold War. It's about the entire period, not just vehicles. So we wanted to bring the human side of it. Bottom line is there were actual proxy wars, of course, like Vietnam, where it went hot, real hot. So the thing about aviators is, you know, we can be shot down, right? Of course. So that happened a lot, unfortunately, during the Vietnam War. A lot behind enemy lines, and when it happens, if there's no survivors, basically there's no real way to go in and rescue the people or recover the bodies. So years later, then, all that has been eroded down, and bodies have been buried and such. So it's very hard to recover remains. But here in America, we care a lot about our our soldiers, Marines, airmen, and seamen. So when we lose them, we do everything we can to recover the remains. So that's what this build is commemorating then. There's a cost to all this. The Cold War, there was a lot of good that came out of it. There's a lot of bad that came out of it. The bottom line is there's a cost to it, and not just the expense of maintaining a military. So what this mock is commemorating is the fact that we have been able to go back after peace has taken place in Vietnam. They have allowed us to go back and exhume a lot of the remains that have been found. Of course, almost all of them are aviators, and the reason why is we're not finding the bodies per se as a telltale sign. We're finding pieces of the aircraft. When you find a piece of an aircraft, you can determine it's an American. Then we're going to go in and we're going to see, well, is there any remains there? And that actually has been a very, very, very successful program with the Vietnamese to recover a lot of our missing soldiers. And they bring them back all the time. You'll see in the news where we have soldiers and Marines, airmen and seamen come back and they give a full service and buried in Arlington Cemetery and all that. So this is a little build to commemorate that. And Bret Harris actually took part in some of that effort there a few years back. So he wanted to build that mock in commemoration.
Very great work, yeah. A lesser known side of a lot of what we have here.
Absolutely. I mean, the cool vehicles, they're awesome. A great part of history as well. But there's also the human cost that needs to be captured. So some of us have done that in effect. Yeah.
And what do you have for us here?
Okay, so I don't mean to skip a couple mocks, but we'll go ahead and since I'm up to bat. So, I knew that no matter what I tried vehicle-wise, I was going to be outclassed immediately. So essentially, I asked to do something historical and something nobody else is doing. So that's why it's such a sore thumb sticking out here amongst all these vehicles. And that is espionage. So a huge, really important part of the Cold War that a lot of people don't realize is the fact that there was a lot of spy work going on. And we're not talking stupid James Bond garbage. We're talking about people who suddenly, for whatever reason, decided to turn sides. And so what I chose is the Cambridge 5. It's not well known in America, but these guys were the single most successful spy ring in world history. And the secrets that they gave the Soviets absolutely impacted us. I'll give you an example of how dangerous these guys were. They essentially were able to gain access because one of them, Kim Philby, was actually the CIA a British intelligence LNO over to CIA. So he found out through spying and reading minutes of meetings that America was not willing to go to nuclear war with the Russians over Korea. That gave the Soviets free hand to interfere in Korea. And it was only their interference that actually stopped us from winning that war. So if you think about it, these guys, these 5 traitors, actually helped the Russians achieve a great victory in keeping North Korea communist. That's the level of what took place with these guys. What I'm trying to show here, though, is they weren't James Bond. 3 of them were drunkards. In a way, they were far more lucky than smooth. And so here's an example of this. What I wanted to capture is this moment here where Guy Burgess, one of the main spies, is handing off top secrets, at the time known as Ultra in British speak, okay, in British intelligence speak, to a Russian KGB agent, okay? So Ultra, what is it? Ultra was essentially the decoded information secrets that the British were able to determine from Enigma. So if anyone's ever seen Imitation Game, that movie, that is what we're talking about. Those secrets they were obtaining. Unfortunately, there was a guy named Cairncross who was in Bletchley Park, who took a lot of those secrets, handed them off to Guy Burgess, and then he would hand them off to the Russian KGB agent. In this particular time, though, to show that these guys were no James Bond, this clown, Guy Burgess, at the time was so drunk that essentially when he went to pass his briefcase of Ultra top secrets to the Russian KGB agent, he dropped it. It busted open, and top secret went everywhere on the side of the sidewalk, and it was right in front of a British policeman. So basically, the British authorities had their one moment where they could have busted the ring. What happened? The British policeman politely bent down and started picking up the papers and politely handed them right back to Guy Burgess and then moved on. So, of course, then the Russian KGB agent got all the secrets. What was in that was actually German battle plans for the Battle of Kursk. So the Soviets won the Battle of Kursk for many reasons, but one of them was because they knew exactly what the Germans were going to do. Why? Because they learned it from the British spies. So obviously history would have turned out different if they'd have been able to stop this. The only reason why we know this happened is because the KGB agent was so pissed off about this incident that he wrote Guy Burgess up and called him a drunken fool and said they shouldn't trust anything these guys hands off. And as it turns out, actually it was the secret to the Battle of Kursk. So they went on to spy for well over a decade, almost 2 decades, and finally one of them was found out by American intelligence. And he and Guy Burgess fled to the Soviet Union, and that was the very first indication that the British had that actually there was something up. A lot of damage caused by these guys, not just the information that was handed off, but also when the Americans found out about this, they basically lost all trust for the British intelligence services. And not a single one of these guys served a day in jail. In fact, none of them were prosecuted. When they finally caught up with Kim Philby, and he actually admitted it, they didn't arrest him. They just kind of said, well, we'll get back to you. And of course, what did he do? He fled to the Soviet Union the very next day. So the entire start to finish with this whole escapade with these Cambridge 5 is kind of just as far as you can get from James Bond smooth business. But I just wanted to commemorate a little kind of a moment to say, hey, you know, the Cold War was about more than just, you know, vehicles and cool stuff. It's also about this side, this espionage piece. And the Cambridge 5, not very many people know about them in America, probably because the Brits really don't want people to know about them. But yeah, it's a kind of a strange little bit of history.
I should mention here we're at BrickFair Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C., where there's the fantastic International Spy Museum, yes, where they tell a lot of these types of stories there. So if anyone's in the area, definitely check that out because there's a lot of really cool stuff there.
Good call. Yeah, absolutely.
But thank you for bringing the build here. It's a great story.
Thank you.
So let's see if we move down.
Yeah, I can talk about the PT-76. That's this light tank here. I didn't build it, but it's basically a light reconnaissance tank. The Soviet, this one I believe is in East German markings. It was amphibious, which is kind of novel for a tank, so I don't think it would have been very heavily armed, but it is a tank. It's definitely, you know, it's got tracks, it's got a high caliber gun in it, and what else to say about it? It's a great mark. I really like how the guy who built it did the base where it's sort of coming out of the water and sort of illustrating its amphibious role.
Sense of action you get with that.
Yeah, it's very nicely done. I like that a lot.
Starting out here, this is a little diorama I made, Destruction of the Berlin Wall. It's a small vignette, 16 by 16 studs. It's supposed to be depicting when the Berlin Wall was being destroyed by the Eastern and Western German citizens because you know, they'd been separated for years and decades even, and so this was the first time when unity was possible. And you know, this is kind of an iconic picture. This picture right here is kind of like, you know, I tried to emulate the picture a lot, and you know, it's loosely based off of it, but yeah. That's what it's supposed to depict.
I like how you've incorporated kind of the black steel inside the concrete.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to get that scene right here. It's exactly the same. You see the reinforcement poles inside, and I wanted to use that. Yeah. Yeah. Next up here is the B-58 Hustler escape pod. So the B-58 Hustler was the first supersonic bomber that the United States Air Force used, and since it was so high and fast flying, they needed for the, you know, if the crew ever got into an accident and the plane was totaled, then they would have to shoot out in this escape pod that was pressurized and had oxygen and everything. Yeah. Next up is it's the Kiev class. It's called a heavy aircraft cruiser. It's you know, effectively an aircraft carrier because it carried aircraft for the Soviet Navy, right? And so they kept all the vertical takeoff landing aircraft on this kind of ship, and they also had all their helicopters on this kind of ship as well. And the interesting thing about it is that it was a mix between a cruiser, which had, like, you know, missiles and guns, and then it was also a mix of an aircraft carrier because I had a deck right there for aircraft takeoff. And then this is the USS Nimitz, which is its counterpart, the American counterpart, right? So the USS Nimitz is you know, the first carrier built in its class of super carriers. All right. So you know, obviously the USS Nimitz was in service for decades, even, you know, got retired a few years ago. And this is kind of to show how it was back in the, you know, during the Cold War, like kind of a little later in the Cold War, because you have the C-2 Greyhound cargo aircraft there, which weren't there until like later in the Cold War. But yeah, it's this is showing the USS Nimitz during the Cold War. Yeah. Okay. Now in the back, this big bomber right here is the Tu95 Bear. It was the Soviet counterpart, closest thing they had to the B-36 destroyer that we covered earlier. And so this thing, it has this Lego model. You know, I put some tiles on the wings. It's about 4 feet long. It has space for 2 minifigures in the cockpit, and it has like a kind of a good interior. There you go. There's an interior in there. Has like steering wheels and everything. Then it has in the back, there's space for a tail gunner, and the tail gunner is you can move the tail guns. And then the bottom, there's a bomb bay. You can't see it too well from here, but there's an opening bomb bay. It has a rotary launcher for cruise missiles. Yeah. So you know, I think that's about it in this model.
I think you and Jack are clearing out the world supply of gray tiles for these massive planes.
Oh yes, definitely. The Lego store got a lot of business out of me for those gray tiles. Yeah. Over here, this is the MiG-25. The MiG-25, it was the fastest armed military aircraft to ever enter service. It was everything about it was insane. The exhausts were insanely huge. The intakes are insanely huge. The nose is insanely large. The cockpit was incredibly small, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum. And then you have, like, you know, the landing gear wheels were huge as well, and the whole thing was very long. It was longer than like almost any of its other competitive aircraft from the West, as you can see here. You know, like looking at the German F104 versus the MiG-25. It's insane. Yeah. So
when you were working on a plane like this, what was your like photos or you know, types of stuff that you were basing it off of?
Right. So this thing was based off of a 1:40 scale blueprint. I used the 3-view drawings of it, right? And you know, all the proportions are right. And I also, you know, I used reference photos for some of like the color issues, I mean the color schemes and everything. And also, you know, I researched a specific MiG-25 for you know, to find the right decals and to find the right missiles configuration. So this is my C2 Greyhound, the Grumman C2A Greyhound. This was my largest effort for BrickFair because you know, the Tu95 was the biggest thing I brought, but it was I used it from last year. I just updated it a little bit, but this thing was completely brand new since last BrickFair. It has a lot of working features. So starting out here, you have the opening side door, side access door, right? You know, spinning propellers, obviously. It has folding wings, which is a very important feature for all Navy planes, right? And also, I managed to put light bricks on the wingtips. You see that right there? Yeah, there you go. Also, it has wing flaps here. There you go. Those wing flaps right there. And then it also has tail flaps like that. And then it has a cargo door. And the lights are on right there. I left them on from last time I opened it. I don't know how long that's been. And it has, you know, a resting hook right there. So that's, you know, those are basically all the working features I could have incorporated, and I think this model turned out really nicely. And, you know, I even got nominated for Best Aircraft over here.
Yeah, and it's also very strong. You can lift it up and, you know, move it around.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that was a really important feature. I knew I'd be showing people a lot of the working features on this aircraft, so I thought it would be necessary to have it being able to move easily. Yeah. And then I also built with it this little diorama of a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier deck. Yeah. Also, it has you can't see the interior much, but it fits one minifigure inside, just in case.
My name is Corvin, and I got asked by Magnus to sort of help a little bit with the collaboration here. And since I'm a pretty big airplane fan, I built a couple of jets. So what we have here is the Canadian CF18 Hornet, which is sort of the export variant that went up north to Canada of the F-18 Hornet that was in service with the U.S. Navy and has now been replaced by the Super Hornets. Yeah, and is the Canadian Air Force is using it. The reason they chose it originally was because the F-18 is designed for carrier operations, so it has a very rugged landing gear and it's got the folding wings and all that other stuff, which also made it suitable for like the rough terrain that they have up north. So that's why they chose that one. There's a couple of differences between this one and the standard Hornet that you may know from the Navy, which is, for one, it has the black canopy that is painted underneath the aircraft. I can probably lift it up here. Down here around the landing gear bay, which is sort of meant to momentarily confuse somebody if they ever engage somebody within visual range. And the other big difference is this tiny little spotlight here that they use for identifying other aircraft at night when they're flying, because one of the main missions of the Canadian Hornets is to serve with NORAD as part of NATO, and they use them to frequently intercept the big fella that you see behind there, which is the Tu95 Bear. So that is actually one of their main roles, and you oftentimes will see like newspaper articles where they have pictures of them intercepting these big bombers up north.
This is an interesting model with the like very skinny nose there on the front.
Yeah, it is. It is. I've worked on this like on and off for quite a while. So the first version of this I designed way back in probably something like 2012, 2013, and it's been an on again, off again project. And finally this year I managed to physically build it and get the nose right and the way I wanted it to, especially also with some other details like the air intakes down here. Which are curved but also sit very flush here, so that was a bit of a tricky area to get right. The same thing with the landing gear, which also does some weird things. Luckily we have some new pieces nowadays that make these things a bit easier. So yeah.
Great work. So then what else do we have here?
Then what we have here is a German Navy F104 G Starfighter. Again, an export from America, built by Lockheed at the time. The F104 was originally conceived as sort of a high-speed, high-altitude daylight interceptor. So you might have seen it as part of like the old school sort of Century series of fighters where they have like the shiny and chrome sort of exterior. And if you've watched the right stuff, it's somewhat the Mercury 7 pilots were flying in and breaking all sorts of altitude records and other stuff. And then Lockheed got the idea of marketing this thing abroad, and one of the main export customers was Germany, and they bought almost 1,000 of them, and some of them were built under license over in Europe for the German Air Force and other, but the West German Air Force actually, with the Cold War divide going on at the time. The only problem was, as it turned out, for one, the German Air Force and Navy originally did not want this plane. It was more Lockheed bribed or allegedly bribed the German Minister of Defense at the time, and they came back from meeting. It was like, good news, guys, we bought the F104. And they were like, okay, we hope this goes well. And it didn't, because what they also did was, as a very young Air Force at the time, the German pilots weren't too well trained, and the crew also not so much. So obviously it got better over time, but the other thing was also that this high-speed, high-altitude interceptor was turned into a low-level fighter bomber, which unfortunately led to the loss of almost a third of the airplanes in crashes, and well over 100 German pilots were killed during peacetime in all sorts of accidents. So the aircraft in Germany actually gained the title Widowmaker. So
I feel like that captures a lot of this Cold War era technology, though, with like the arms deals like that, and then also just experimenting with new things, you know, with like what Germany was doing there and figuring stuff out kind of as they went along.
Yeah, it was actually quite a bit of a sombering build. As you can see here, underneath the aircraft, what we have is actually a nuke strapped to it. So the scenario we are seeing here is actually an F104 of the so-called Quick Reaction Force, which was NATO-supplied nuclear bombs strapped to a jet ready to go, with the pilot and crew waiting to get the word go in case the worst happened. And of course, it never did, thankfully. But yeah, there were German air crews just sitting there literally under U.S. military guard, forbidden to leave because they might have been needed, but also forbidden to approach the aircraft because that had a nuclear bomb strapped to it. So yeah, it was actually quite a bit of a sombering build process for this one, because you sort of start thinking about what it must have been like to be in that situation. So yeah, thankfully that never happened. Then next to that, we have the probably very well-known F16 Fighting Falcon. The way that came about originally was in the 60s and 70s, there was something called the Light Fighter Program. So the Air Force was looking for a very sort of like, affordable, lightweight, and highly maneuverable fighter jet that could compete. So what they did was they held a competition, and the two sort of final entries in that were, one was the YF-16, which eventually became the Fighting Falcon, and the other one was actually the YF-17, which was the basis for the F-18. And the F-16 won that one, and became sort of one of the sort of most successful fighter jet designs ever. So they're still produced to this day in very advanced versions. And some of the original novelties they had was like the fly-by-wire system. So the thing about the F-16, not only is it light, but it is highly maneuverable because it's designed unstable. So you have planes that will fly, if you take the hand off the yoke, they will fly straight, nothing happens. Some of them will go up, others will go down. But some of the modern fighter jets, what they have is they are inherently unstable. So what they have is flight computers that actually keep controlling the control surfaces to give sort of small inputs to keep the plane flying level. And then the pilot gives the inputs that all gets computed with some insane programming and math and gets turned into the actual maneuvering that the plane does. But the plane itself is actually unstable in the air, which results in like this super agile little fighter. So yeah, so that was a fun little build to do. It went through a couple of iterations. The first time I actually built it was with that canopy piece, the bubble canopy, which came out in 2016. So when that came out, my first one was like, oh wow, that looks like something I could use. So I turned that into an F-16. It was a little less refined than this one, and yeah, over the time, builds evolve, builds get revisited, and I refined it a bit, and that's what we have here.
And you got the nice little scene that kind of to set it on there to kind of create the whole scene.
Yeah, it's always nice to give them a little bit of context. So this is roughly based. I used to have a plastic model kit of this jet, and it was sitting on like this beige tarmac. So that was a lot of fun. Okay. And then back here, we have the successor to the F104, the Starfighter, and then later on the F4 Phantom and other early German jets. This is the Panavia Tornado, which is a collaboration. So back in the late 70s, or in the middle of the 70s actually, Germany, West Germany, the UK, and Italy joined together and founded the Panavia Aircraft Corporation with the goal to develop a new fighter jet for them, for Europe. And what they wanted was something that could do a lot of things. So they want a bit of a bomber, a bit of a fighter, a bit of an interceptor. And the way they went about it was to do what the Tomcat also did, is to have this variable geometry wing. So what that does is it gives it very good controls at high speed, but it also gives it nice maneuverability at low speed. Because this would have been, as a German jet, would have been one of the first to get into action if something ever happened during the Cold War. Yeah, so that was... Yeah, they built that, and it entered service in the early 80s. And the UK actually just retired theirs earlier this year, but Germany is still continuing to fly the Tornado, yeah, up until 2025, when they will be phased out, and then the Eurofighter Typhoon will take over all their duties.
That's impressive. It's been in action that long. It tells you, I guess they were successful with it.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, it's been around for quite a while.
Your model here, I love the coloring on it. I know some of these others we've shown so far are kind of mostly just gray, but you were able to get some almost like camouflage patterns in there.
Yeah, yeah. So the German Tornadoes, they've gone through quite a number of camouflages. So this is, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember this correctly, this is called Norm 76 camouflage. I had to look that up because I did a lot of research. So the very first prototypes, obviously, it came in like nice factory colors and marketing schemes, but like the actual sort of testing ones later on started having camouflage. The thing is, the most iconic Tornadoes are painted in black, a very dark olive green, and then a slightly lighter shade of olive green. The problem is we don't have any colors for the bricks that do that. So I looked around, and eventually I found a color, this Norm 76 color scheme, which actually eliminated that because it had sort of grayish patches, greenish patches, and black patches. And then the bottom of it is actually sort of a whitish light gray. So I'm very happy that I managed to replicate that. So while you have the camouflage spots on the top, the bottom is actually light gray all the way through. So I'm very happy that I managed to get that in there. And then the last one I brought is the famous U-2 spy plane, operated by the CIA originally, and then the United States Air Force, and later on NASA. And the scene we're seeing here is a U-2C flying over the Soviet Union at the time, about half a second before a Soviet anti-air missile shot it down. And this was the U-2 that was piloted by Francis Gary Powers. So if you've seen Bridge of Spies, you know what happened there. So
kind of one of the more iconic stories of falling behind enemy lines there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they were doing these overflights, and originally what the thinking was behind the U-2 was that the United States estimated that above a certain height, the Soviet Union would be unable to defend against planes. So they were saying like, okay, their anti-air capabilities aren't strong enough. They can't reach us up here. As it turned out, they could. So the original cover story obviously was because you can't really keep a plane hidden. Even back in the 50s and 60s, you know, people will see it taking off eventually and will ask like, hey, what's that thing doing? So the official excuse for this was it's a weather research plane, which funnily enough NASA used it for later on. But that was sort of the cover story. And then Francis Gary Powers got shot down over Russia, and he survived and got taken captive, which the Russians didn't tell the Americans. So the Americans were like, oh yes, the plane was shot down, unfortunately the pilot was killed, and then the Russian came in and were like, actually, we got him. So that was very awkward and sort of exposed this whole weather research as the cover story that it was. Yeah. Other fun tidbits is that, again, there's sort of like a bit of a correlation between the builds, is the U-2 originally also built by Lockheed, same guys that did the SR-71 afterwards, the sort of Lockheed Skunk Works as they were called. They took this one and they based it originally off of the Starfighter. So they took the Starfighter and they changed the fuselage a bit, and mainly they lengthened the wings to get sort of the lift capability, which eventually resulted in this very capable plane that could fly really high. The downside to that is they really engineered this thing to do one thing and one thing only, which is fly as high as it can and spy as well as it can. So they shaved off every comfort and everything they could get away with. They had to develop a new fuel specifically for this one that would operate at the high altitude.
There was no first class on this plane.
Oh, definitely not. And so they made it to go fly really high, and that resulted almost in this sort of configuration that looks very much like one of those privately owned glider planes you can see at airports sometimes. And it wants to do the same thing. It wants to glide, you know. So the wings are so efficient actually that up in the air they're super nice, but once it comes time to land, what the pilot has to do is he has to come down, and he actually needs help from the ground. So they have a chase car that goes after the plane as it's going down the runway, calling out the altitude because it's such a hard to fly plane. And the wings, to generate lift so much that the pilot actually has to stall the wings, so almost touch ground with the wheels, purposefully disrupt the airflow over the wings so the thing will fall out of the sky. And the other thing is, because they saved so much weight down on it, it only has landing gear. There's sort of, this is mounted so I can't really turn it over, but it's sort of mounted down here in the back in sort of a bicycle configuration. So it has to balance on those two wheels, go down the runway. Eventually one of the wings will tip, hit the ground, and then it comes to a stop, and then they will run out and they will put these so-called pogo wheels under it, lift it up, and then it can taxi back into the runway.
Simple procedure.
Simple procedure. So it is one of the most notoriously hard to fly planes in the inventory. So imagine having to do that after you've already been in the air for, like, I don't know, 8-9 hours or however long they fly. Yeah, so that's pretty much it about the plane. One small detail about the thing is I looked up where exactly Gary Powers was shot down, and then I pulled up Google Maps, and the little area you see underneath the plane, that is actually modeled after the map of the area of where he was.
Nice. I love that attention to detail. And yeah, your Lego models are incredible, but I also love all the research you've done. So is a lot of this knowledge that you kind of went in beforehand before you started the models, or do you kind of do a lot of research on a specific build as you're doing it?
Yeah, a lot of it goes into it as I'm building it, because some of these, like, normally I would have never thought of building a Starfighter or a U-2 because other people have done them as well, and they might have even done, some of them I think are actually better than mine, you know. So there are some of these where I'm like, oh yeah, I could do that, and then you go into it and you go into it blind, and then you go like, oh wow, this is actually quite fascinating. So while you're building and trying to design this model, you actually learn a lot about history. So that's also a fun aspect of it. It's a cool model, but it's also, you get to learn something and you expand your knowledge of history a little bit. So that was a great fun experience.
Hi, I'm Matthew Hacker. I'm a builder from upstate New York, and for this Cold War display, I wanted to represent an army that is probably less represented here than the Soviets and Americans that seem to dominate the display. So I wanted to highlight the French, and specifically two aspects of what the French would be expected to do in their assistance in case the Cold War went hot in Western Europe. So since really the 13th or 14th century, artillery has been the weapon of war. And that really hasn't changed, despite the fact that aircraft now get all the glory. And yeah, they're very important, but artillery is still the king of battle. So my model of the TRF-1 howitzer, it's a very late war, Cold War design. It uses ballistic computers to calculate where the shots are going to fire, and it would have replaced all the previous French artillery. In fact, it was still entering service and replacing older systems as the Cold War ended, but it represents the very end of, or rather the pinnacle of French artillery design. The next vehicle that I built was the AMX-10 hot variant. The AMX-10 is actually a direct response to the Soviet BMP-1, which was a revolutionary infantry fighting vehicle, which allowed infantry to be supported by high-caliber weaponry and a bit of armor as they got into battle. So basically, the BMP-1 was first entered service in 1966, and then the French and the rest of the West scrambled to introduce new designs. So the AMX was introduced in service as an IFV in '68 and the early '70s when it started entering service. The version that I built, however, entered service in the '80s again. As the older vehicles started tiring out, they realized that it was an excellent chassis and could be used for a plethora of roles, one of which would be as an anti-tank guided missile carrier vehicle. When you think of the Cold War and the war going hot in Europe, you probably imagine a wave of Soviet armor, and that is a reality that would have been faced. So the Western Allies needed to have force multiplying capabilities such as anti-tank guided missile carriers like the AMX HOT. So basically you have a small vehicle, lots of missiles, take out a few Soviet tanks from behind cover like my little display shows, and then it would scoot away and hopefully live to fight another day.
And I think that's another good example of kind of this Cold War era technology where you have those responses, so like one side develops something, the other side has to do it, and you just basically went back and forth like that.
Absolutely. The Cold War was definitely a technological struggle. as well as an ideological one. And everyone always tried to get the one leg up over the other.
I can talk about the BMP next, which is the gray and tan one right behind. I think Matt may have mentioned it. It is the Soviet vehicle that was developed, I think, in the early or late 60s. And it was really quite a revolutionary design. It had the sort of firepower of a light tank, but it was able to carry infantry in a protected way, kind of like an APC. Like I was showing the M113 earlier, and this is sort of like a vehicle a little like the M113, but with more weapons and perhaps a little better armored. And when the Soviets rolled this out, the West sort of scrambled to catch up with a variety of IFVs of their own. This is an infantry fighting vehicle, and one of the places it was used was in the war in Afghanistan, and I guess the little landscape I have represents that a little bit. And just as the U.S. got entangled in the Vietnam War, Soviets went into Afghanistan in I think the early 80s, maybe late 70s, and they had a somewhat comparably very frustrating time there. Despite technological superiority, they were not able to win. They were not able to make that work for themselves. But the BMP went on to spawn a variety of follow-up BMP designs. This is the BMP-1, but there was a BMP-2, and they can keep making more similar vehicles. And this was sort of the original infantry fighting vehicle. It gives the infantry both the firepower, mobility, and protection to kind of keep up with tanks in an attacking capacity. So they've sort of become pretty in the modern era. Most infantry would like to be able to go into battle in an IFE. They've become pretty commonplace. And that was the original one.
There you go. So you had to capture that very nicely there with that model.
Thanks. I'm really proud of that model. I was building in a style that I don't build so often, where it is scaled to look good with minifigs outside, but it doesn't necessarily have space for the figs on the inside. Yeah. I built a couple of vehicles in that style, and that's the one I'm probably the happiest with the angles I was able to pull off.
And what else do you have here?
So I can show you a Norwegian IFV, which is this NM135. You may notice that looks a lot like the M113, and that is because it is a modified M113. Has a turret on the side with an autocannon for a little extra firepower. And I actually was in the Norwegian Army a very long time ago, and I served on one of these. So that's
you have
what
personal experience with this then.
Absolutely, and I've sort of in the back of those things and riding around in the winter. It's pretty cold, but you're glad for a bit of protection, and so if you don't have to march anywhere, you're better off in the back of one of those things than having to walk yourself.
Is this the common camo pattern there with kind of the white and green?
That is the winter Arctic pattern we were using in the late 90s, and I'm pretty sure that was used in the certainly late 80s also, which is when the Norwegian NM135 came into use during the 80s. So I'm 95% sure that's the right camouflage for that. Yes, and it was fun, doing taking a model I had built last year and using the same base model, but changing it up a little bit. And this is a vehicle that means a lot to me personally. They're not in use anymore, so they do, they're a part of history now. Yeah, that's during the Cold War. I mean, Norway, has a border with Russia. I mean, yeah. This was pretty serious business, and the nightmare scenario was that there would be an invasion, and the hope was that the Norwegians could slow down the Soviets for a couple of days and hopefully buy a bit of time for the rest of NATO to come in with some reinforcements, and then whoever was still alive of the Norwegian forces would then be behind Soviet lines and carry out a guerrilla warfare. So it's pretty daunting to think about what that would actually have been like. But that was what we were told was the great plan. So thankfully that never happened. No, it was good to be able to build that one as well. I also built the T-64, which is this tank here. This is a Soviet tank. Soviet tanks tend to be smaller and more compact than the Western counterparts. They often have autoloaders, which means that they only need 3 crew instead of 4. They have a little less armor, but they're quite mobile and agile, and because they're smaller, it makes them slightly harder targets as well.
Kind of lower to the ground a little bit.
Yeah, a lower silhouette is the idea. And my understanding is that the T-64 is one of the better ones they have. Lots of the different Soviet tanks of the Cold War era all look very similar, and it's a little unclear to me the extent to which each of them is its own design compared to just a development of the previous one. But the T-64 was one of the more expensive ones and had some innovative features at the time. So if there had been a conventional war between East and West, the T-64 would have been one of the tanks that would have been in the front lines, coming through Europe, for example. So I went with a winter Arctic camouflage for this one as well. In part because of the parts that were available in the different colors, and I just felt like that was the best match for that. The turret, which is strange and rounded, was a little hard to pull off with Lego, so I did my best with some curved slopes there. I'm pretty happy how it turned out.
My name's Seth. I'm from Pennsylvania. I built the MIL Mi-8. It's a Soviet medium twin turbine helicopter. It was designed in 1958. And it was produced shortly after that. It originally was designed as a civilian transportation helicopter. However, after the widespread success of the Bell Huey in the Vietnam War, they decided that they needed an aircraft that was capable of taking troops into battle as that one did. So as far as the history of it, it was used extensively throughout its time of being developed. It's still actually being produced today. It's one of the 3rd most produced helicopters in the world, with over 18,000 units built of it. So it's still being produced today, and yeah.
You got the unique sand green and tan colors there.
Yes, it does have that unique camo scheme. This was definitely similar to something that was seen during this time. Depicted in the scene is in the Soviet-Afghanistan War. So this would, this was a camouflage that was seen during that time. They also had some blue on the underside of it to blend in sort of with the sky. When it was flying overhead, it would be less likely to be detected on the ground.
Even like the lighting you were able to incorporate as well.
Yeah, yep, the lighting just lit some parts of it that, would typically be lit during nighttime operations and things like that.
Now, when I think of the Cold War, we have lots of different stuff. But one of the critical things in the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. The Soviets and the United States were both developing nuclear weapons, and were looking at these were seen as an insurance. If you had enough nuclear weapons to destroy your enemy after they attacked you, he might be deterred from attacking you. And that's still the situation today, nowadays. But in the Cold War, it was it was new. Nuclear weapons were new, and because there was this really strong divide between East and West, this was at the forefront of people's minds. And also, there was no arms control at the start of the Cold War. This thing is an Atlas ICBM. That's an intercontinental ballistic missile. It could fly 12,000 kilometers. I don't know how many miles that is. I don't do miles. I'm from the Netherlands.
That's okay. Google is there for a reason.
Yeah, so basically halfway across the world, from launch sites in the United States to targets in the Soviet Union, to deliver a nuclear weapon. That's the white bit at the top. That's a 3.75 megaton nuclear weapon. To give you an idea, that is 200 times as powerful as the nuclear weapon used against Hiroshima. So we're talking very large-scale destruction. Deliver that to targets in the Soviet Union. There were 72 of these in the early 60s, stationed at 5 different locations in the United States in underground silos. Now, I would have loved to build an underground silo, but I flew here from the Netherlands, and you know, it doesn't fit in my suitcase, right? So the way this system worked was that it was underground. The missile was underground until it was launched. Then the whole thing was raised up from the ground, and you can see the 2 doors on the sides that opened up that would allow it to come out. And then when it was sitting on top of the surface, then it would be launched. And I think the launch preparations took about half an hour, so it was really quite quick. And it could fly those 12,000 kilometers in another half hour. So it could. Imagine that the United States was under nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. They could strike back within an hour with this giant weapon. And that's a very Cold War thing. And also, in my day-to-day life, I teach at the Netherlands Defense Academy, and I teach about missiles and rockets. So for me, it seemed a really natural choice to build this sort of thing.
You're very familiar with this type of weapon.
I'm very familiar with this type of weapon. I've done calculations on it. I've used it to validate computer models. So when we came up with the idea for Cold War, I said, "Oh, I'll do nuclear weapons." Even though, I mean, let's be honest, they are massively destructive. They are not. I don't like nuclear weapons, but I do have a sense that if we wouldn't have had them, to some extent, you know, we might have, East and West might have actually have gone to war. And the threat of this destruction in the background basically meant that we didn't. And is that a good situation? No, but it has kept the world more or less safe in decades. So it's also, in terms of the history, it's also interesting. And these are now gone, but there are still similar missiles are still on alert in the United States and in Russia, still with the same mission. So that's there are fewer now because there have been arms reduction treaties between the Soviet Union and the United States, and now between Russia and the United States, because more nuclear weapons doesn't necessarily mean more safety. So they had they came to an agreement, realizing that this was getting out of hand, and that's a good thing, obviously. But this was not an easy process. So there were in the 70s there were treaties to reduce these strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles. There was an agreement to build no more and to limit their number, but that didn't stop the arms race initially. And we're in early August now. And only a couple of days ago, it was announced that the intermediate nuclear forces treaty between Russia now and the United States has been cancelled. And this is a treaty that was also an arms reduction treaty, but this dealt with weapons with shorter ranges, and that's where these models come in. Because in the 70s, the Soviets started introducing that thing. That's an SS-20. Well, you can't see the missile, but I'll explain that in a moment. And that could fly about 5,000 kilometers, and from the Soviet Union could hit targets in Western Europe in 15 minutes. And that wasn't covered by the existing arms reduction treaties. So that was seen as a direct threat to Western Europe. Also, the thing is mobile. Well, what you see is a vehicle, a 6-axle vehicle, and the actual missile is housed in a cylinder that is now mounted on top. Vertically, but when it's driving around, they would lower it to a horizontal position. And because it's mobile, it can well, it can drive around. You don't know where it is. So if you want to destroy it to prevent it from launching its missile, you have a challenge. That's not an easy thing to do. To counter that, the United States introduced the Greyhound ground-launched cruise missile, and that's this thing, also a mobile system. And these were introduced in Western Europe, in 5 Western European countries, including the Netherlands. This launches cruise missiles from the launcher on the back. It's also a mobile system. In time of crisis, they would be driven to locations somewhere in a forest, or I try to build some scenery.
Kind of a remote location.
Yeah. It's hard to find a remote location in the Netherlands, but still. And this thing housed 4 cruise missiles, also with nuclear weapons that could be launched at targets in the Soviet Union. Now, these things being deployed to the Netherlands was not popular. And obviously there was a peace movement, and in 1983, the largest protest in the history of the Netherlands was held in The Hague, with 500,000 people out of a population of 14 million going to a large protest march in The Hague, demonstrating against the introduction of new nuclear weapons in Europe. So I have the protest here represented by some people. The sign, Bon de Bom, is in Dutch, but I figured that Americans would be able to figure out what that means. And I felt, this is an important part in Dutch history. And I felt I wanted to represent that Dutch bit as well.
And really, I think in the history of the Cold War in general, you think about like Vietnam and some of the protests in the U.S. and a lot of these conflicts.
Sure. So we have all this pretty impressive military stuff, but there is a negative side to this, and 500,000 protesters out of 14 million people, that's not a marginal little movement, right? These people had a point. So ultimately, these weapons were supposed to be deployed to the Netherlands, but they weren't, because the United States and the Soviet Union signed the INF Treaty, which has now ended just 2 days ago. I think nobody in their right minds would like to go back to the situation that existed when these things were actually current. So that's part of the decision why I built them. They look cool. A 6-axle mobile missile launcher, that is cool, but it is a weapon of mass destruction, and the technology's cool, but its intended purpose really isn't, and the world would be better off without these sort of things.
And I think it's really unique the way you can tell those stories through these Lego builds here. So what is some of the public reaction like when they see these models and kind of hear about their use and kind of what their purpose was?
I don't know. People seem to. I'm not sure whether people get it. I hope they do. I hope they don't look at the banner and go, "These stupid protesters can't spell." This is a joke Gary made. I don't know, but we have the information on the sheets as well, and I found that people tend to be fairly interested in this, and it is still directly linked to current events. Right? The discussion is ongoing, and who knows, depending on how things will continue between the United States and Russia. These sort of things might come to the forefront again. It's not something that would make me happy, but it could happen. And I think it's important to learn from history, and actually, I think, to prevent that sort of thing. But that's my personal opinion. Right. I teach about missiles, but that doesn't mean that I'm looking forward to them being used.
Right. Exactly. You can kind of separate those two things out with learning about it, while obviously wanting them to never be used.
Sure. I look at these things as a necessary evil. But I'd prefer it if we wouldn't have them. Cool Lego models, right? I get to. Part of the idea was we're going to build stuff that's slightly out of our comfort zones. Well, these things are kind of cool, but they also make me feel a little uncomfortable. So tick that box. But also, I don't build minifig scale ground vehicles normally. There they are.
Pushing yourself into a different area.
Yeah, and. Now, we did an interview last year when we had the Vietnam display, and I had a U.S. Marine Corps helicopter, dark green, and I said, looking at it, I found the perfect piece for the nose of that helicopter, which was a green curve piece. And I said, I don't know what, I never knew what to use them for. Well, hey, green missile launcher, and there they are, the cap that sits at the top of it. They pop the cap off before they erect the missile. That's 4 of those pieces again. Very useful pieces, those. I mean, I get to use stuff that I didn't think was useful for anything. So in terms of Lego building, this was fun. And building trees and whatnot, and building the camouflage, I very much enjoyed that. But I do also enjoy the history and the context, and I think that's something that all of us try to do in this display.
For sure. Well, thank you, Ralph. Some excellent models here, and big thank you to everyone who helped us with the video here. There's so many incredible models on display, so I'm glad we could spend the time to actually capture all the stuff that you guys have here. So really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the attention, and thanks for your interest. And yeah, we'll see you next year.